Welcome to the first episode in my Nazi podcast series, Legacy and Lessons. I am honoured to have with me today, as the first guest, Professor of History and Legal Studies and dear friend, Michael Bryant. How are you, Michael?
Doing great, thanks. How are you doing, Johnny?
I'm great. And this is the first podcast I've done under my own name, and if there was anybody in the world that I could have join me for this first one, it would be you. So I'm very grateful that you found the time to do this.
It's my great pleasure. I'm really happy to be with you.
And my introduction of you was quite short because I thought it might be interesting for us just to have a bit of a chat about your background and a little bit of mine and how because we've known each other or we first communicated to each other years ago now, probably 3 or 4 years ago. But I think it's interesting to hear how you came to be involved in the Nazi period so heavily and why you stayed in. So it's going to be a little bit truncated, but what brought you to... So one of your first major books was Confronting the Good Death, the Nazi euthanasia trials. What brought you to that topic in the first place?
It's a long and twisted road, my friend.
The Twisted Road, yep.
Long and twisted. There's actually a book called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz.
Oh, yeah, I know it. Carl
Yeah.
Schwinner's, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually quite a good book. No, it's a long snaking path, but I mean, this was not my first career. I was a lawyer and a military lawyer at that. So I was actually an Air Force officer for 4 years. And decided during my time as an Air Force officer that I wanted to do something other than what I was doing at that time, at least in the
So
long
when
term.
are we talking about? What year?
1990 through 1994, I was
Okay.
a captain in the U.S. Air Force. I was stationed overseas in Germany, which is where I really was able to solidify my German. It was a major moment in my life as I look back at my career. I think that was a major turning point. But I got out and decided to take the GI Bill and used that then to go back to school, get a PhD. When I was in my doctoral program, I wasn't even thinking about specifically focusing on Nazi crimes. I was actually...
What was your PhD in? What was the subject?
It was in modern European history with a focus on Germany. But the Nazi period, well, obviously it was exceedingly relevant to modern German history in particular, but that's not what I wanted to focus on. I actually was more inclined to look at mysticism among German religious scholars in the 19th century. Which always
Wow. So yeah, so it really was a twisted road then.
It was a twisted road, and it's funny because you look back at your life, and everybody can do this. You look back at your life, and you see just what appear to be like coincidental, kind of serendipitous sorts of things that happen, both for good and for ill. And one of my advisors, with whom I was quite close, was a wonderful woman named Marilyn Waldman. And Marilyn was probably, had she lived, I think I probably would have gone down this path of focusing on 19th century German encounters with mysticism, and Eastern mysticism in particular. But she passed away fairly early on in my doctoral program.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it was years ago. This is 1995, I think it was 95 or 96.
But I could tell when you mentioned her name, I could see pain etched on your face, so I knew that something must have happened to her.
She was a wonderful person, and but again, I'm sure a lot of people, even listening to this podcast, have had similar experiences. She was not my key doctoral advisor. She was a secondary advisor. I think that she would have become a more important, advisor had she not passed away. But my principal advisor was Alan Bayerson, who was a fairly well-known scholar. He wrote a book called Scientists Under Hitler. It was very well reviewed back in the 1980s, I think it was, when the book came out. It was very, very, very well known at the time. It still is, for that matter. It was really a marvelous advisor. But he was a very pragmatic kind of guy, and he was of the view that you had to think in terms of the market. And this, I can't think of better advice, especially today, with the paucity of academic positions, especially in humanities and the social sciences, particularly for people who do the kind of work that we do. There's just not a super abundance of jobs, and especially at least in the academy, right, in academic circles. So he was very pragmatic, and he said, mysticism is really interesting, and I'm sure you'd get a lot out of it, but you need to think in terms of the market. Why don't you consider looking at something related to your legal background? Because I did have a law degree and practiced law for 4 years, and he suggested doing something related to Nazism and the law, especially the post-war trials. I encountered a book around the same time by Dick DeMilt, whom I think you've gotten to know a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think his book is so good. It was his dissertation. I think it was
Which one is it?
In the Name of the People.
Right. Yeah. Is it just? It's only available. It's not available in English, is it?
Yeah, it is.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you read it in English or did you read it in German?
I've had excerpts from it, but I assumed that these excerpts had been translated into English. But yeah.
Yeah, I thought he had written it in English, but I mean, I'm not really sure. I had to go back and look.
He's Dutch, right?
He's Dutch.
Yeah.
It might have been. He might have written it in both Dutch
And German.
possibly German,
Yeah.
German, and then English too.
I knew it was available in German. I didn't know it was available in English.
Yeah, it's a marvelous book. I think it's an underrated book. I think it's extremely important. It's been very influential, and it's just such an exhaustive, deep dive into the euthanasia trials and also the Operation Reinhardt trials. Those are the focuses of the book. And what I liked about Dick's work, I mean, at least in terms of its influence on me, I think was the fact that he talked about Nuremberg to a certain extent, but Nuremberg was a parenthesis. It wasn't the major focus of his book. The book was really focused on the German trials, and there were so few scholars at that time in particular who really focused on the German trials. I mean, I think Dick's book was really path-breaking in a lot of regards. Not that people hadn't written about it. Certainly, there were figures who had written about certain aspects of the trials, the German trials, I mean. And certainly C.F. Reuter, for whom Dick worked for many, many years. C.F. Reuter was a scholar at the University of Amsterdam, professor of law, who had collected all of the judgments from both the West German trials of Nazi offenders.
Wow, it's an amazing resource.
Oh, it is.
I was back in there for this podcast because we're going to be talking about Ulm, so I was looking at the trial judgments for Ulm, and now you can use AI to translate things. It's accessible to all of us now, really. But it's incredible that somebody must have typed all of that out and digitized it.
Just a stupendous. Yeah, it was Dick. I think that's really been
incredible resource.
One of the major projects.
I'll put the link into the description if anybody's interested. Yeah.
I can't praise Dick enough. He's in addition to everything else, and maybe even more importantly, he's just a wonderful person, right? I think that's an important observation to make, and it's true for everyone, no matter how good a scholar or how professional or accomplished we are. Ultimately, quality of the person is everything, and Dick is among the very best people you will meet.
Well, you find a lot of decent people in our field because
we do.
I suppose you've got to be, haven't you? To
and if you're not decent when you start with the study of this material, maybe you become a better person as you engage with it, because it certainly has changed me, and I'm sure it's had that effect on you too. And that would be worth exploring maybe in a later podcast.
At this point, did you so you've read Dick DeMilt for the first time. Your PhD advisor had basically guided you in a general direction. And at that point, did you go and deal with some primary sources by yourself, euthanasia sources?
Yeah, well, actually, Dick's book was so influential that I thought, I'd never even heard of these trial judgments being published. And now I knew, so I went to I went to the Holocaust Museum. I was a fellow there for a period of time as a graduate student, and I just made copy after copy after copy. And that's what we did. There was no digitalization at that time. we took out the books and we photocopied them, and I made I made photocopies of all of the euthanasia materials. I was interested in T4, primarily because that was my first exposure to Nazi crimes. When I was a graduate student, actually a law student, in the 1980s, I was an exchange student at the University of Göttingen for a year, and I was trying to improve my German. My German was so rudimentary and so primitive. I was really struggling to understand what I was reading. So I did a crash course just on my own of trying to read accessible but still serious academic literature, and I stumbled across the work of Ernst Clay. And for those who are maybe listening to the podcast who are privy to some of the inside game of this field, you probably would recognize Ernst Clay's name. He was at one time the world's leading authority on Nazi euthanasia. And he wrote a series of books dealing with not just euthanasia, but also the post-war trials of euthanasia crimes. So this is where I was really first introduced to the topic of T4. I had known nothing about this at all. I was
No.
in my mid-20s,
Well, I'm not surprised that it wasn't until the beginning of my PhD. Obviously, I knew what T4, I'd heard of it and I knew what it was, but I hadn't appreciated its significance and I hadn't understood how understanding T4 would completely change my understanding of the Holocaust as well, which it did. So it's a good way round for you to do that, to have gone into T4, the murder of ostensibly disabled people by the Nazis, and then into the Holocaust, because we have those massive overlaps as well, don't we?
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. I knew nothing of this. It's interesting, just as a kind of a parenthesis here. I first discovered something about the euthanasia program through a novel. It was published in the 1980s by Walker Percy. You might have read it, I don't know, but it's called The Thanatos Syndrome.
Well,
Walker Percy, an American novelist, fairly well-known American novelist. I think it may have been if it wasn't his last book where he passed away, it was one of his last books. And he actually has a section that deals with a former Nazi doctor who, survived all the legal proceedings after the war, and lives into the modern period, the post-war period, and there's all kinds of drama surrounding his biography and his activities after the war. But that's the first time I'd even heard of this, and I was wondering if the author was not just making it up.
well, yeah, it is unbelievable. It's
Because it's unbelievable.
the collusion, or well, just the involvement of the medical establishment in Germany is quite breathtaking when you learn about it.
I was a more, I guess, a little more naive than I am now. And at that time, as a young person, I just couldn't believe it. I thought this has to be fiction, right? And
Yeah.
I looked into it a little bit, and there really was a Carl Schneider, Werner Heide. All of these names were cited in the novel, and then I sort of kind of filed it away in the back of my mind. And then later, I re-encountered these names through Ernst Clay's work, which was again another serendipitous event.
And these were leading scientists, not just in Germany, but in the world as well, weren't they? Their papers were read across the pond in America, especially, but they were highly respected.
Think of Klaus Schilling, who did the malaria research at Dachau.
Yeah.
Under different circumstances, he might have been a Nobel Prize winner.
Well, Carl Schneider as well.
Schneider too.
I think he was he at Graz in Austria? Oh, no, he was at Heidelberg.
He was Heidelberg. Yeah. Schneider was Heidelberg. That's right.
Yeah. So leading medical establishments and universities across Germany, and Julius Hallervorden is a big one as well. And I remember just read it. Obviously, there's so many atrocities and absolutely sickening things that you come across. But the the harvesting of children's brains by
Yeah.
Julius Halvorsen for medical research, and it really was. I can see how a scientist might get drawn into this in a sense, because the opportunity to do science, which just would be unthinkable anywhere else, to have basically unlimited supply of brain, what they would call like human material, and then for there to be no ethics code whatsoever. They were probably thinking, justifying it in a way where they were saying, well, we could make these incredible medical advancements. The people are already being killed by someone else. Why throw this, why just ditch these human remains into a pit somewhere where I can use it for medical research? So,
Of course, at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, that was one of the defenses of the doctors, was that these are people who are going to either be killed or going to die anyways. So, we should be able to extract as much medical knowledge from them as we possibly can.
yeah,
That defense didn't work, and it shouldn't work, but that was nonetheless in their minds at the time. And of course, it's not that they didn't have a sense of ethics. It's that they drew a very tight line. It was a very circumscribed sort of ambit for their ethics. They didn't regard these Untermenschen, these people in the camps, as being wholly human, and instead they were enemies of the Reich, or they were racial degenerates, or whatever language they used at the time to depreciate and devalue these individuals, and to render them then fit for kinds of barbarous mistreatment, which was meted out to them. But at any rate, this is sort of how I embarked upon this this path. It led to my first book. It was my dissertation. It turned into a book, confronting the
so
good
it
death.
was confronting the good death initially your PhD dissertation.
It was, yeah. Of course, the original PhD was 680 pages long. Right? So as a young graduate with a degree in modern European history, I'm not going to get anybody to publish a 680-page monograph. So I had to cut it substantially and buffed it up a little bit. And
That this was your first time dealing very, very comprehensively with atrocity sources of the most unimaginable horror.
and they were primarily legal sources. Yeah, they were primarily legal at that time.
These legal sources are often people giving testimony in court and trial judgments, so they're detailing quite meticulously the crimes that took place.
I think that's where I discovered the extraordinary value of these proceedings. Remember, I was at a conference, it was a long time ago, 2004 or 2005, and I did a presentation. It was at the Holocaust Museum. I did a presentation. Chris Browning was there. A few other eminent scholars were there. And I tried to make a point that Chris Browning also made. Somebody in the audience asked about the value, the legacy, the most significant legacy of Nuremberg. And I think I made the remark that I thought preserving these records for posterity, the records of Nazi atrocity, was perhaps the most important single contribution that Nuremberg made, and maybe even over above the punishment of these terrible crimes. And most people think of that as being the primary legacy, idea of accountability for political leaders, military leaders. And I wouldn't argue with that, but I think of equal significance, certainly for our study, our understanding of the Third Reich and its crimes, preservation of those records, which might have been destroyed or might have gone missing. Who knows what would have happened had they not been seized and preserved.
Yeah,
it's a major accomplishment of Nuremberg.
Yeah. So after you'd written the PhD dissertation on euthanasia, you then subsequently went on to focus on the Operation Reinhardt death camps.
Yeah, and again, you can see Dick DeMilt's influence on my work, because Dick had a similar sort of strategy, right? He focused on euthanasia, and then he moved on to Operation Reinhardt. And I had access to the Reinhardt the original Reinhardt proceedings, including the preliminary investigations by Ludwigsburg, the central office, which maybe we can talk about a little bit
Yeah,
later.
we will.
So I had access, and I actually spent some time at the Zentrale Stelle in Ludwigsburg and made copy. I spent beaucoup dollars, or I guess at the time euros, on these, because at the time, again, you couldn't just digitize stuff. You had to make paper copies, and so I made thousands and thousands of pages of copies of the investigations and the judgments and the interrogations and so forth. And so yeah, that led then to Eyewitness to Genocide, which was published in 2014, looking at the trials of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka.
And
So
that must have been a very, very tough process, because the way that we know each other is because I've chosen to specialize on the Operation Reinhardt killing centers. Well, one in particular, Treblinka. So I've peered into the cavernous abyss of human suffering. It's beyond anything you would fathom in the darkest recesses of your mind until you get in front of these sources. And when you're reading the sources and you decide that you want to keep one, or you want to use one in the paper or the book that you're going to write, you end up reading this same source over and over again, because you're thinking, okay, where am I going to fit it in? Okay, and then you're proofreading your own paper. So you get to know these particular atrocities really, really well.
yeah, they kind of sup with you at your dinner table, don't they? I mean,
Yeah.
and whether invited or not. Yeah, I talked about this a little bit in the Dark Horse podcast with you and Brett Weinstein.
Yeah.
I mean, the impact of the engagement with these materials, and as I was working on the second book, Eyewitness to Genocide, really began to register, I think, even at a subconscious level, because I used to have nightmares about the things I was reading, and they would express themselves in really strange ways. And again, I don't know if this is something that you or even people listening to our podcast can relate to or not. Maybe you've had similar experiences. I remember there was one nightmare I had. I don't mean to turn you into my shrink or anything, but telling you about my dreams. But one nightmare was I was in a house, and it was like in the third floor of the house, and I knew that I was being hunted. And I was furiously dashing around trying to find a place to hide. I knew that there was somebody downstairs. I could hear them moving around on the first floor looking for me. And I knew that if they found me, they would kill me. Never had any dream remotely like this until I delved into these materials. And I think that was was a dream that kind of surfaced as a result of the materials I was reading.
I
But
have indeed, yeah, had similar experiences, because I was really quite busy during the writing of my dissertation. I had a full-time job. I've got a young family, had a young family back then, and I knew that I shouldn't do my reading before going to bed, especially not up to the moment of trying to, okay, and then turning over, trying to go to sleep. And I just knew from experience that sometimes you're like, when else am I going to do my reading? I literally don't have any other time. So you're like, maybe I'll get away with it. So you do your reading. Maybe you have 5 or 10 minutes, try and wind down, and you just hoping you get away with it. And then you have these really lucid dreams of violence. Maybe I'd be in one of the killing centers myself. Maybe I'd be being hunted down. Maybe it was just like some other form of violence, like, I was having a knife fight with somebody, but just like extreme violence. And sometimes it'd be really lucid, and I would know that I'm in a dream, and I'd be trying to wake myself up in the dream. I'd be like, right, just wake yourself up now, get out of here. So very strange, yeah, these very strange experiences, and I've only experienced anything like this since I started looking at the magnitude of the crime and the massive cache of testimony that's been left behind.
I'm sure the dreams are due to what we're reading.
Oh yeah,
Without a doubt. And I guess this gets to the question of objectivity and the extent to which you can kind of separate yourself from what it is that you're studying. And I think anybody who does Holocaust and genocide studies at a pretty serious level will find that they cannot maintain a stance of pure objectivity. You were drawn, whether you like it or not, you were drawn into this because there was so much human evil and human suffering and human wickedness, and it's something that seeps into your pores and permeates your being at a certain point. You try to fend it off, and you try to maintain that neutral scientific sort of stance, but the material is just too cancerously alive. And maybe it's a good thing that we have this capacity for empathy and for relating to the suffering of others. Maybe that's not such a bad thing,
Yeah.
Just response.
Yeah. And if I went to Auschwitz twice last week, and if I ever went and felt nothing, I'd stop going.
Yeah.
And the same with this. If it's fantastically interesting, and that's one of the points of this podcast series, to have these interesting conversations about fascinating points of history with interesting people. But ultimately, it's about, okay, what can we get from this? There's got to be a point. How can we try and build a better world from the knowledge of this, from the study, from the analysis, from extrapolating meaning from this? How can we then apply it to the world and take lessons from it?
And I think that's an especially important point when it comes to this topic. If you're studying something maybe a little more staid, you're studying, I don't know, crop rotation practices in Burgundy in the 15th century or whatever it is, something that's far more removed and maybe more academic, if that makes sense. Perhaps we can just focus upon that practice as an antiquarian form of knowledge that might be interesting to some people, maybe to some others it's not so much, but it doesn't have a lot of immediate relevance to the lives of many people today. But
no, ironically, that could have well been something that Himmler would have studied, because he did agronomy in university, so that could have well have been something that he studied. But yeah, so that was how me and you first met, was that I'd been to Treblinka on site-based visits, and I'd wondered why there wasn't more written on it, and I'd seen a gap really in the field for some more literature on Treblinka, and there's one book on the Operation Reinhardt death camp trials by Yitzhak Arad, which is kind of the staple book in the field. And then I like that book. Obviously, he's done loads of research, so there's loads of documentation, and I reference it in my dissertation. I like that book, but I do have issues with the way it's written, especially the uprising section of it. It goes, I think, too much into a narrative style rather than, I quite like the non-fiction narrative style, but it feels quite fictional when you get into the uprising part. And then I came across your book because I was thinking, okay, is this possible? Are there enough primary sources on this? And then I came across your book, and that was really important in convincing me that there was enough there, because you'd shown that these trials had taken place. And I knew that if you'd been able to get all this information and sources, that there was much, much more out there. So that was a pivotal moment in me deciding that, yeah, I am going to focus on Treblinka. And the first time I communicated with you was me asking you where can I get some more primary sources, and you kindly pointed me in the direction of Dick DeMille and the cache of trial judgments. And there's obviously a lot of information on Treblinka. There were 3 different trials focusing on Treblinka, and there's the trial judgments are plentiful. And then, you kindly pointed me in the direction of other sources as well, and they're with that, I had a huge amount of information that I could make my own dissertation from. And then subsequent to that, I asked you if you would be the reader of my PhD dissertation. So we've been collaborating and discussing and working together. I think that was probably about a year and a half ago that you became my PhD reader. And then since I've graduated and me and you have continued to collaborate.
Yeah, that's pretty much the path that we've that's brought us together. And of course, we were on Brett's Dark Horse podcast a few months ago.
Yeah. And I thought it would be good. Initially, the idea was let's do Belzec's Obibor Treblinka trials because that's your bread and butter. That's my wheelhouse as well. And we wouldn't have to do much preparation. That's what we know. And then it's underrepresented as well. And lots of people don't know much about this area. And then I thought, well, we're going to have, I think to give some context, we should go back and do the Ulm Einsatzkommando trial, because that is really the first West German trial prosecuting Nazi criminals, and it gives, as people will hear today, it gives some really important foundational concepts, but context to understanding the later Operation Reinhardt trials. It really sets things in motion. And I think before we get to that trial, we should give a little bit of a context of post-war Germany. So there's 1945 Germany. The Allied trials take place over the course of 4 to 5 years, and it's before the creation of the Bonn Republic of West Germany in 1949. Germany is under Allied occupation, and the most famous trial is the International Tribunal, the Nuremberg trial. But lots of people don't know that there were subsequent Nuremberg trials. So there were another 11 trials after the main International Military Tribunal. But there was a concept in Germany after the war. It says in German, I think it's called Stunde Null, 0 hour. So Germany had obviously been devastated and destroyed structurally, and people, for obvious reasons, wanted to forget what had happened during the Nazi period and start afresh. And is that your understanding of the concept Stunde Null?
Yeah, I mean, Stunde Null is the idea, as you said, that Germany was bombed to back to the Stone Age in certain parts of the country. I teach in Nuremberg course for law students every year, and we're in the Altstadt, the old city, at the center of Nuremberg. 85% of it was destroyed. It was beautiful,
Wow.
beautiful old medieval city that had been around for 1,000 years. And most of it was just wiped off the map. And so much of Germany was that way. It was just a smoking ruin by the end of the war. And so the Stunde Null idea arose that really Germany had to just reset after two ruinous wars that they lost, and the second one, of course, being so materially devastating to the country. So many people killed, and not just people who died in connection with the war itself, but now the surplus of genocide and the legacy of genocide weighing on the country. Stunde Null represented a break with the past, and it was a concept I think that was pretty easy to sell to people. I think it was an appealing idea for Germans, the idea of a reset.
Yeah, of course. You can imagine why this appealed to people, and people are like, what? So we can just start anew? And many of these people were criminals themselves. There were, at the end of the war, there were 8 million members of the Nazi Party. So there were millions of Nazis who were thinking, yeah, well, can we just, chalk that one off and move on? And I'm not going to go to prison. And, I've committed all these atrocities, and I'm never going to have to there's never going to be any repercussions for them. And this is heavily linked to the bad apple theory as well. The country had been hijacked by a few psychotic Nazis. Some people call it the three-person crime. So Hitler, Goring, and Himmler, like they're all dead now. So hey, we were hijacked, and it's this. And one of the bigger picture things that I'm going to talk about at the end of this podcast is this victimization narrative and how powerful these victimization narratives can be. And the German people, lots of the German populace were saying, okay, we were victimized by the Nazis. They descended down on us, and look what's happened to our country. And lots of German people had suffered terribly. We didn't mention the mass rapes of the Soviet army as well. This is a place that's been completely destroyed. The horrific, maybe one of the largest campaigns of mass, military sanctioned mass rape in human history, probably the largest. So for obvious reasons, they're wanting just to move on now. They don't want to remember the past. And then the Allied trials are depicted as a foreign cell. So when we get to 1949, and there's also the Crowcast as well, which is a registry on that the Allies do for war criminals. So it's the UN War Crimes Commission published the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, Crowcast, in 1948 in Germany, and it put down, and this was only a minuscule amount, but it was 60. They had a list of 60,000 people on that list. And then we get to 1949, and it's the Cold War as well. There's East and West Germany, so there's no appetite for prosecution, would you say, at the beginning of the Bonn Republic in 1949?
Yeah, it's an interesting trajectory that we see here, because don't forget that the U.S. Army, I don't know about the Brits, but I know that the U.S. Army actually conducted polling, because they were very interested in the attitudes and ideas of the German population after the war. After all, the Allied Control Council was now the government, the de facto and de jure government of Germany, so that the Americans wanted to know what the Germans were thinking. And there was one poll that indicated in 1940, I think it's 45 or 46, it might have been early 46. But one of the polls came out coinciding with the Nuremberg war crimes trial. And they asked the German respondents, do you approve of the Nuremberg war crimes trial as a way to mete out justice for the crimes that were committed? And an overwhelming percentage, I can't recall exactly what it was. It's been a few years since I looked at the survey, but I think it was 75% were in favor of the Nuremberg trials. That was right after the war, 45, 46. And then, of course, the U.S. Army had a similar survey that was done much later. I think it was in 49, just before West Germany emerged as a sovereign country. And they had the same survey. Do you support continued punishment of Nazi war criminals? And the numbers had flipped. So 75% opposed any further engagement with the prosecution of people for Nazi-related crimes, or war-related crimes. I think that's quite significant. So within a space of 4 or 5 years, the Germans had gone from being overwhelmingly supportive of prosecuting Nazi war criminals to the view that they should no longer be prosecuted. So what does that mean? How do you interpret that? I think what it means, and again, this is an interpretation, it's one I subscribe to, but people have their ideas, maybe other theories. But my view is that the Germans thought that once the major Nuremberg proceedings were over, that was it. Hitler was dead. Goering was convicted, committed suicide in his jail cell on the eve of his execution, so he's gone. You have waves of top Nazis who've been put on trial by the end of the 1940s. The Einsatzgruppe trial had concluded by then. And most of these people had been convicted and either sentenced to death by hanging or to long prison terms. And I think that the Germans were just done. They were done with it. I've heard a lot of people over the years criticize the Germans for this, and when I go to conferences or when I do public talks at universities, I still hear this, and I hear it from faculty too. And it's like a topos of academic discourse about the post-war trials. The attitude is that the Germans were really shirking their responsibility to confront the full amplitude of the crimes committed by the Nazis. And it kind of looks like that. You can make that argument, I guess, on its face, but at a certain point, maybe a person needs to step back and try to see it from a broader angle. I just don't think that human beings as a whole are willing to do this. I mean, when I think about my own country, and maybe it's true for the UK too, I don't know, but certainly with my own country, people in this country are not willing to confront the crimes that have been committed in the name of the nation state. I don't think that's unusual. And the crimes, as we both know, are so extreme.
Mm.
They're mind-bending. I mean, they're so outrageous that when the first reports began to trickle back into the West about the final solution, governments were saying this has to be a forgery, right? It has to be a fabrication.
Well, yeah, victims as well. The news was getting to the ghettos and concentration camps, and victims were like, "Well, no." Churchill said it was a crime without a name.
I mean, I'm actually working on a documentary film with a director. I'm one of the producers of the film, and he's over there right now filming in Western Poland around Chełmno, where it's a film on Chełmno. It was the first death camp. So I've been pouring through the documentation on Chełmno, including the trial records. And as bad as Treblinka, Sobibor, the rest of them were, there's something about Chełmno that is special. And I mean special in a really unnerving, disconcerting way. And I would invite people who are interested to maybe do a deep dive at some point into Chełmno. But my point is that these crimes are indescribably evil.
Yeah.
We have our My Lai massacre in the United States, which was terrible, absolutely terrible event. And Americans were unwilling to confront that in the late 1960s. There was actually a major cover-up of this shooting of over 500 Vietnamese civilians by Charlie Company, Vietnam War. And as awful, and I've read the trial records from that as well, as awful as that is, it pales in significance beside the kinds of crimes committed by the Germans. And the reason I'm saying this is that I think it has a major bearing on why the Germans really wanted to move beyond further engagement with this. The attitude was like you said, Germany was bamboozled into supporting this movement, the Nazi movement. Germans were kind of enticed into supporting the government and led into a war which a lot of people did not want, according to this narrative. And the crimes were committed by the SS. And the crimes were committed by Hitler and his entourage, the top people in his government, along with the SS.
And they thought that the big trials, the trials early on, the IMT and the Einsatzgruppen trials would be almost like a cleansing action. And the main perpetrators that were brought to trial there were kind of almost thrown underneath the bus. And it was like, okay, so we've got rid of all that was toxic. We've basically amputated the cancer from our nation now, and we can move on. And what else would you expect of people to want to do as well?
Exactly.
Because lots of them are personally connected. If they weren't personally involved, then their brother, their uncle, their father was. They knew someone, maybe their friend. Everybody knew somebody that had done something atrocious or played an important role in the Nazi system and the Holocaust. And now, and it's not like Germany hasn't got any enemies anymore. We've got East Germany as well. We've got Stalin as well. So they need to rebuild. They need a civil service. They need policemen. Where are they going to get them from?
I have become much less judgmental about alleged German passivity in the face, or even denial in the face of Nazi crimes as I've gotten older, because I see it even today with crimes that have been committed by again, I use the example of my own country, committed by American forces in Iraq or Afghanistan. There are war crimes that take place, and individuals who were supposed to be held accountable, but in fact were exonerated, who were pardoned by the former president. Um, in an act of breathtaking audacity and contrary to every instinct of justice, simply quits, not just pardons individuals who are deeply involved in criminality. So seeing this, and just seeing the disinclination of people to really be willing to come to grips with crimes that are awful. When you look at the Germans, these crimes are not just awful; they're on a scale the likes of which maybe have never been seen in history. We'd have to rack our brains, right? You go back to the Genghis Khan and Tamerlane and some of the stories that were told of these people, but even they may have failed beside the examples that are the Nazis. An example for this wanton destructiveness and willful malevolence that infected all sectors of society. You can't just pin it on the SS, like you said. I mean, we talked about the doctors before. And some of them were SS doctors, but some of them weren't. Right? Some of them were just ordinary doctors. In fact, very illustrious figures within their field who became criminals on a level that one scarcely glimpses in the annals of
Yeah, the people that are there to protect you, for German Jews, they were savagely attacked by the people that were employed to protect them, doctors, policemen. They were the most dangerous people.
I mentioned Kelmno before.
Yeah.
Kelmno death camp. So Kelmno was administered by the Sicherheitspolizei, more or less, the security police, in other words.
Yeah.
The people who are supposed to be in charge of security, in charge of protecting people. They're the ones who ran Kelmno, where a gas van was used to murder hundreds of thousands of Jews. And you read the account, and I'm just reading a trial judgment a couple of days ago. There was an interrogation of one of the leading defendants, and he was talking about how he would give this speech to the Jews who had been shipped from the Łódź ghetto or from the Kolo district, the area around Kelmno, different locations. They would be shipped then or sent to Kelmno. They would arrive. It was in like a enormous building. It was called the Mansion, and they would file out of the truck, and there would be this guy who would meet them, and sometimes he would put on a white lab coat and give them a speech talking about they had to take a shower, then they would be redeployed to gainful work, either in agriculture, doing something else, but all they had to do is take a shower first. They said, "Step this way, please. You have to disrobe, take all your clothes off." He was wearing a white, at least in some cases, he was wearing a white lab coat. It's clearly designed to try to put the victims at ease, to reassure them, to project this image of authority, right? Just an extraordinarily malevolent activity. But so getting back to the theme, though, the Germans are trying to come to grips with this history by the late 1940s. And how tempting would this be, just to pin everything on Hitler, Heydrich, Himmler, the SS, and so forth? The top, the summit of the Nazi police state.
And
they were the perpetrators.
Do you know what it reminds me of a little bit? When Hitler started out, one of the main things that he campaigned on was abolishing the Treaty of Versailles and, the war guilt clause, but all of the conditions that were imposed upon Germany, and all that shame, all that heartache, all that embarrassment of losing that war. And there were these concepts of Diktat and Dolchstoss. And I feel that Germans were like, what? So we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend that we were cheated out of this war and scrap the Treaty of Versailles, and it'll be almost like it never happened if we vote for him. And there's almost, and you can see why that would be tempting to people. And I can see a similar process going on now. As they're like, what? So we can kind of try and sweep this under the rug and like start all over anew, and it might be like none of that ever happened.
Yeah, and you certainly see that with Fischer-Schweder, right? With the
Yeah.
Ulm trial.
Yeah,
His-
let's move on to Fischer-Schweder, because it's interesting how one man's action and one man's story is so central to the West German trials. And Fischer-Schweder, just let's begin with who he was in 1941. So he was a commander of Einsatzkommando Tilsit, and they were a subdivision of Einsatzgruppe A, who followed Army Group North through the Baltic states. And they were called Einsatzgruppe Tilsit because the members were made up of the police and the SD from the Tilsit region. But Fischer-Schweder was the police chief of Memel, and when he became police chief of Memel in 1941, he was given SS rank as well. And he became one of the commanders of this Einsatzgruppe unit, and they murdered people along a 25-kilometer stretch of the Lithuanian-German border. So the border towns that had
East Prussia,
East Prussia, and famously Garsden is one of the places where these massacres took place, and he played a leading role in leading this unit, but he also voluntarily took part in the shootings himself, although he didn't need to. He was a commander for whatever reasons. For maybe he wanted to show leadership, maybe he just had interest in being involved in the shootings himself. But he went and he was pulling triggers himself and finishing people off when they were on the floor. And there was, we might get to this later, but when the truth of who he was starts to come about, there's accusations of horrifying sadism, like making victims jump over a ditch and then saying that they would survive if they got to the other side, and then when they were in the air, shooting them dead into the ditch. And by the end of their operational activities, this Einsatzgruppe unit Einsatzkommando unit had murdered around 5,000 people, and they were especially active straight after the invasion of the Soviet Union. When you look at there, and there's quite detailed operational logs that were sent to the commander of Einsatzgruppe A, detailing what Einsatzkommando Tilsit had done, which later became very relevant. So this guy was a mass murderer. And then we see, after the war, he is interned in an American POW camp. So this is 1945 and 1946. And the denazification process in Germany, my undergraduate dissertation was actually in denazification. So I've got a good understanding of these denazification questionnaires that were given out. So we've got to understand the vastness of the job, denazifying Germany. And this means on all fronts, that especially people, the old guard, the people that had been Nazis since the 1920s and had held SS positions, those were the ones that the Allies especially wanted to remove from any position of authority. So
particularly the civil service, right? Civil service was one of the major.
So yeah,
focuses.
any government employees especially. And these questionnaires, I think if anybody listening or watching this has never heard of these questionnaires, they are absolutely it's almost incredible to think that they were relying on the honesty of the people filling out these questionnaires. So it's like, were you a horrendous mass murderer during the war? Yes or no? I'll just take no for that one. And it's that ridiculous, isn't it? So Fischer-Schweder is filling
that
this
ridiculous.
out. Do you remember this Nazi, the inaccuracies that he put on his denazification questionnaire?
Yeah. He made no mention of the fact he was in the SS. I mean,
Yeah, and he also changed his name from,
yes.
he's called Bernard Fischer-Schweder, and he changed it to Bernard Fischer, and he changed his birth date from, I think it's like February the 14th, 1904 to January the 12th. So he's a sly one, and obviously he's a sly, murdering Nazi bastard, this guy. And I think the reason
There's that emotional reaction pouring forth, right?
yeah, and you've got to laugh though, haven't you? Otherwise,
That's true.
and I think I was thinking about the reasons for these slight changes on the denazification. Why don't you just make himself a completely new name up, and why is his birthday just moved a month? And obviously he says that, yeah, I was working for the police, but he leaves out his SS membership. That one's obvious, and that's just a complete omission. But what reasons do you think, why is he just changing it slightly here?
Yeah, I can only speculate, but to me, it's having worked in criminal justice for many, many years, obviously never dealing with a case quite like this one, but certainly with people who are trying to throw the law off of their scent a little bit. I mean, to me, it's fairly clear that what he's trying to do is just create an alternative identity for himself. And that would be enough, right? Changing your birth date and fundamentally changing your name. At that point, you're in a position to be able to fend off, at least technically be able to fend off charges that you might have been a certain Bernhard Fischer-Schweder, who worked as the director of the police in the Tilsit Einsatzkommando. Right? He might. Oh no, I'm not that guy. My name might be similar to that, but no, I'm a different guy. That's somebody else. You're thinking of someone else. I mean, to me, it's clearly trying to throw. He's trying to preempt the possibility of being identified because he knew how incriminating, and this is a key point, right? He knew how incriminating his work was.
Yeah.
He knew it.
Yeah. And you can say later on down the line, oh, it must have been an administrative error that someone else has made. Like, if it comes down to it, you can say, it must have been, some lost over the, someone else has transcribed it, and it's, unless they get the document that he's actually written, which is busted, but he can then say later on down the line, oh no, that was an administrative error. So
of
he's
course,
able.
It's a skein of lies. I mean, and we see that through his career, all the way through his conviction, right? In 1958, he's ensnared in coil after coil of lie after fabrication, and it's not surprising because he was deeply incriminated, and he was trying to, like the country as a whole, was trying to have a Stunde Null. This is like a personal Stunde Null for Fischer-Schweder. That's what he wanted.
It's a bit of a rebirth, actually, wasn't it, for him? Because a bit of a rebirth.
Yes, exactly.
Completely reinvents himself. So he leaves his wife straight away as well. We don't know if I wouldn't put it past that guy if he's like, well, if she's gonna get me busted, so I'll just leave her as well. No, he's a disgusting human being, so I can't imagine any scruples about ditching his wife. And they'd been married about 15 years, and then he was like, so it's a bit of a coincidence that he decides to completely reinvent himself and then leaves his wife, finds a new wife very quickly, and has children like immediately. So within months of him divorcing his ex-wife and changing his identity, he's got a new wife. He starts to do odd jobs, and moves to a new city. So new location, new wife, new family, new name, new profession, and he ends up being a door-to-door vacuum salesman, doesn't he? Yeah, and then it's because of the amnesty laws, isn't it, that he decides that he wants to upgrade his life. You can imagine he was police chief of Memo. He was he was quite high up in the SS. He was an important guy. He had he had power over life and death. And now he's moving from door to door selling vacuums. And I can imagine, obviously, it's a massive step down for someone like him.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah.
He goes from being the police director of this Einsatzkommando, murdering thousands and thousands of people, to being a door-to-door vacuum seller.
Yeah.
Salesman. It's just
Yeah.
the ironies.
Yeah, some of the doors that he probably knocked on might have been Jewish people as well.
Could have been.
Can you imagine? Like, but then the amnesty laws come in, and these are providing amnesty for people that used to be in the civil service. So Fischer-Schweder's seeing these amnesty laws that come in about 1951.
51. Yeah.
But he waits a little while, doesn't he? Like I said, he's a sly one. He waits a couple of years, doesn't he?
Article 131, right, which is an amendment to the basic law. Got to change the rules and really permitted the re-entry of Nazis, people who had been Nazi party members and who had been removed by the Allies after 1945 from the civil service because of their Nazi past. These individuals now, with Article 131, had a right to file an application for restoration to the civil service. And that was 51. I think he filed there were two applications, I think, that he filed. And the one application was for reintegration into the civil service under the 131 law. He wanted to have himself declared to be eligible.
Yeah.
For reintegration under Article 131. And he waited until 53, I think it was 53, to do that. So he waited a couple of years.
Yeah, lay low.
He was cautious. He was being cautious.
Yeah, well, he's quite competent in being an awful human being, wasn't he? And he laid low, and then eventually he lands on his feet. He gets put in charge of a displaced persons camp in Ulm, and this had kind of fallen into disrepair. It was flooded, or it was made for about 2,500 people. It had 4,000 people in it. These are mainly German refugees fleeing the east, and he's given the top job in this DP camp, in this displaced persons camp. And I think this is January 1954. He gets this job, or he starts this job. And he was fortunate to get that job. That's a good position. I can imagine he was delighted with that.
It was a managerial position, and as a civil servant, right? So his application was granted, and then he not only was he rendered declared to be eligible under 131 for reintegration, he's given this great job in a little area near Ulm, right?
And had he just accepted that and kept his head down, we might not be talking about the Ulm trials, certainly, but maybe these other West German trials that took place. Who knows? Would they have taken place much later and not had the effect, or just looked completely different to how they look now? So if he just keeps his head down now, but he couldn't, could he? So he does a pretty good job, and then about 6 months later, apparently he's considered for a promotion, actually, to an even more prestigious or bigger camp somewhere, but he doesn't get the job. But then he has converted an old stable within this displaced persons camp into a theatre, and the press are like, "Oh, well, that's quite an interesting story. Let's go along and cover this, because he's turned an old stable into a communal area for the people inside the displaced persons camp." But if I was him, I'd be like, I would not be getting my head photographed whatsoever. But there must be like some kind of narcissism and obviously hubris. And this is where you see the gall of this man. So he allows the press in, and it was because of this that one of his guards is patrolling the perimeter. And so there was a guy who is patrolling the perimeter, and sees a guy who he describes as tall, lanky, thin, and pale, pacing up and down outside. And the guard has written this report back to Fischer-Schweder, saying that he's seen this guy, and that this guy said, it's not going to be long before everybody knows who Fischer-Schweder is. I know who this man is. And this is kind of the first point where you can see Fischer-Schweder's great new life starting to unravel. And this guard, who's called Billy Palmer, writes to Fischer-Schweder, I am extremely grieved that there are people who would want to believe your successes in this camp, where you really have given so much effort and done so much. So he's reporting back in a very sniveling way to Fischer-Schweder, and people are starting to notice him now.
Yeah. I mean, all of this is going to lead to his losing his job.
Well, it does, doesn't it? Because after that, the regional authorities reach out to the Berlin Document Center. And I think this is really interesting as well. So regional authorities, they find out, they get a file on him, they find out who he is, find out that he's lied on his denazification certificate, on his application forms. So he's a liar. But this is also going to look really bad on them if they've employed a leading member of the SS to be in charge of one of their displaced people camps. So they just say to Fischer-Schweder, right, just resign. We will give you a glowing reference and the opportunity to resign. You just need to get out of it, and let's, again, sweep this under the rug. It's not good for either of us. And I thought it was, the theme of this guy just being a complete complete sly bastard is again seen in this, because in his resignation letter, I don't know if you've seen this. Have you seen his resignation letter?
I think I looked at it. Refresh my memory.
It says, as for the reason for my resignation, I want to note that an extremely opportune job in the industry has been offered to me, which pays considerably more than my current position. In the interest of my family, I would like to take this offer. So he's
another lie. And talk about the coils of lies, right? And just one after the other. Here's another lie.
And you can see why he's done that, though. So if ever like his new employer gets wind of it, it's like, oh, so why did you resign? Oh, there was a really lucrative position that I needed. To no, you were sacked for being a liar and a murderer, and basically it was clear that you were a mass murderer.
But interesting that his employer, the state authorities, were willing to play ball with him.
Yeah, well, they were probably Nazis too, and they're just trying to cover everybody's just trying to cover their own back, and they don't care. You see this often over and over again. They don't really care if someone was a murderer during the war. They just want to be successful. They just want to get on, like we said. They want to let the past lie, don't they? They don't want to be involved with this.
It's Stunde Null for everybody.
Yeah. And then, so this happens. And again, Fischer-Schweder has now got another opportunity. Just keep your head down. Obviously, that tall, lanky guy was pacing up and down. And he said that you would, be exposed, but you haven't. You've just been sacked. You've been given a glowing reference. You've been given the opportunity. All they've said is, okay, we're not going to report you to the authorities. You've lied on your application forms. That's what you've done wrong, and we're going to resign. It's the best thing for us. So had he then just taken leave, again, would we be talking about the Ulm Einsatzkommando trial? Probably not, but he just can't. So he can't find another decent job. So then the amazing and pivotal moment is, Michael, when what legal measure does he decide to take, which is just beyond belief, really, isn't it?
Well, I forgive me for laughing, but because there is a level of just, the word you used was hubris, and that's exactly right. He thought he was
untouchable,
invulnerable, right? I mean,
yeah,
he was invulnerable. He's the magic man, because he actually he eventually is going to try to plead his case in the papers. He's going to publish this letter. I can't recall what the the Ulm newspaper was.
And sue the regional authorities
Yes,
for
that's right. He
making him
also,
resign.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He does that as well. That's not what gets him into trouble, though.
Yeah,
What gets him into trouble is that letter that he dashes off
yeah.
to the local newspaper.
So he
Is published.
decides that he's going to sue his ex-employers for making him resign because he can't find another job. And this is quite an interesting. So this is coming to light now, and the press are quite interested in this. So they find out a former SS man is suing his ex-employers, who are the people that are the authorities of a displaced person camp. So it's quite an interesting story for the press to cover. And like you said, this letter what was he saying in the letter?
Yeah, I mean, he portrays himself as being a victim. He taps into that victim narrative that so many Germans embraced after the war. And again, being victimized by two sources, right? So the victim of the Nazis.
Mm.
He was actually a victim, not a perpetrator, but he himself was victimized by the Nazis, and then he was also victimized by the Federal Republic of Germany, which
Yeah.
mistreated him and wrongfully terminated him from his employment.
And who knows if he actually started to believe his own lies? Because I know people can. Have you seen what's going on in the world today? People are fed a narrative, they feed themselves a narrative, and they just start to live this fantastical truth, don't they? And lots of people caught wind of this. So Fischer-Schweder is now pleading his case through the press as well, and the trial does not go well for him. Obviously, it's thrown out of court, and then he's saddled with the bill.
Yeah, you're talking about his lawsuit against
his lawsuit. Yes, his lawsuit against his ex-employers is thrown out as farcical, and he's saddled with the bill. So he's not in a great position now. Obviously, it's a significant amount of money for someone that's unemployed as well. But his ex-secretary now, someone called Mita Ponale. And there's a few people that are see this press release that he's done and just thinking, well, that's absurd. One of them says 150% Nazi, and she's the one that relays this story about how he made Jews jump over a ditch and shoot them into it. And then there's ex-people that worked with him that are saying, well, no, he was leading executions. And then we get a prosecutor called Erwin Schuler, who enters the fray at this point, and he starts his investigations, doesn't he?
Right. Appointed by the Solicitor General of Stuttgart, I believe. Erich Nellman appoints Schuler as the head prosecutor of the case. And Schuler is an interesting character too. He'll become the first director of the Central Office for the Investigation of Nazi War Crimes. Yeah, but an interesting character because he kind of had a checkered past of his own.
Yeah, but it's because of individuals and their determination, and Erwin Schuler's a central figure in these post-war West German trials. It's because of people like him, like this individual agency and determination that this is not going to get swept under the rug. And his investigation begins with Fischer-Schweder, then he casts the net out a bit further and finds more perpetrators that are implicated in Einsatzkommando Tilsit. So it becomes more of a trial in the context of the crimes of Einsatzgruppe A in Lithuania, rather than this targeted just on Fischer-Schweder.
Interesting story about Schuler too. I mean, he was actually in Russian captivity at the end of the war. And apparently, during his captivity, he was taken to Auschwitz.
Wow, didn't know that.
It was shown Auschwitz, right? This is after the liberation of Auschwitz by the Red Army.
Mm.
And he thought it was a fabrication. He thought it was just a propaganda tool used by the Soviet Union to try to defame Germany. That when he first encountered this as a POW, that was his thought. And apparently, according to some of the reading that I did in preparation for my book, Eyewitness to Genocide, according to the primary sources I looked at, he continued to doubt these crimes up until the point at which he began to investigate the Tilsit Einsatzkommando
Oh,
and its
really?
crimes. And at this point, he becomes, like, so far as I can tell, a true believer in the truth, the veracity
Well,
of the
that'll do
Holocaust.
it. That'll do it.
Yeah,
So,
and but
yeah,
really interesting character. There are all kinds of fascinating characters involved in these trials too, and he's one of them. He's
because
one of them.
he's there's not many survivors, so it's other perpetrators are just admitting, right? Yeah, like so. Yes, so why would they admit that they were slaughtering women and children if they weren't, and they're implicating each other?
Yeah.
Let's I've got some
Together.
photographs for us to look at actually.
Good.
Let's have a look at some photographs from the Ulm trial. So can you see that?
Put my reading glasses on here. Yes, I can.
Okay. Right, let's have a look at this then. So we have just quickly, in case people are interested, just geographically the areas that they operated in. So these are the border towns of Lithuania and Germany, and this is the route of Einsatzgruppe A. So this border line here is where the atrocities must have taken place, right, Michael?
That's right. Yeah, you can see East Prussia, Ostpreußen in German.
And then we have the man himself. Have you seen a picture of him before?
It's the first time I've seen a photo.
Yeah, well, I thought it was funny because if I said to somebody, imagine like an awful Nazi who 17 years later has turned into a door-to-door vacuum salesman. This would be what you would like. This would be exactly what you'd imagine. He looks exactly how he should, doesn't he?
It really does. Yeah.
And what a disgusting human being. And then, yeah, like we say, this trial itself. So Schuler is able to bring 10 of them to trial, and there's significant media interest in the trial. And then here we have some of them in the dock. I think we've got Fischer-Schweder here. I just think this is a great photo. It's the thumbnail to this video on YouTube as well. It looks like, well, he's not having a great time of it anymore, is he? Poor old Fischer-Schweder.
Yeah, he's hiding his face. Sometimes they would take
Yeah.
newspapers or books or whatever and hold them up.
There are those great
faces.
photographs of the Treblinka perpetrators at the Treblinka trial, and the press are like, must be such an uncomfortable moment to be in for basically everybody in the room, because the press are just stood at point blank range taking pictures of them, and they're all like, they've either got their, it looks quite symbolic, they've got their head in their hands and they're like, you know, they're ducking down like that, or almost it looks like somebody that is in deep shame and regret, but obviously they're just trying to hide their face. But yeah, it's funny
Every
how
so
they
often.
try and,
Every so often you'll encounter one who, every so often, who might
yeah,
be
and
genuinely.
this, look, here he is again now. It's almost comical, isn't it? Now he's pretending to read a newspaper. And this guy's tactic, I don't know how long he's going to be able to keep this one up, but this is just like looking the other direction. And this guy's just like decided to, I think he's even amused by this. This guy's just decided to like hold his nose, which is an interesting tactic. And then you've got the shades on as well, and then Fischer-Schweder in his old pose like that. And then here he is in his dark glasses. Oh, interesting guy. This guy. Do you know this guy's name, Michael? The lawyer that is defending these Nazis.
Yes, but I'm blanking on the
It's
name.
Rudolf Aschenauer.
Aschenauer. Okay.
And there's another one. There's another, but there is some.
I was thinking of Hans Günther Seraphim, but
yeah. There's a few of these people that specialize in trying to get Nazis, either like out of, or just to avoid any kind of punishment whatsoever. There's obviously these far right lawyers that are spending their days defending Nazis, and they specialize in it. And he's one of them. And you can see that he's Fischer-Schweder's counsel here. I think it's really, and here he is with another perpetrator. I believe that this guy is Werner Hirschman, who was another of the main commanders, but this guy is kind of just peeking out as well, like reading something at absolute point blank range, and he's just seeing that the camera's just got him, which I'm sure he's not very happy about. And then we have somebody who rivals Fischer-Schweder for being just obscenely disgusting human being. This is Burma. So do you know this perpetrator, Michael? Hans Joachim Burma?
Yes, I do. Yeah, from them. I think that he was I think he was the superior of Fischer-Schweder's.
He was an overall command, and apparently this guy was just a complete monster. So it was interesting, actually. One detail that he admitted is that he used to set up, just like in any job. So I'm an educator, and if someone's new to the company, they'll come and observe me do my job, and I'll model how it should be done. And he would set up these model executions of exactly how it should be done. It just, I don't know, it just brings it home that this was a job to them, and it was just like almost like the way that we practice, and in our professions they would do things. And here he is again. He looks like what he is, and he would order more people to be chased out of homes because he said the quotas were too low. He would go and say that doctors, if they were Jewish, even if they're treating German people at a field hospital, he would go and get them involved in the executions. And apparently he showed no remorse whatsoever, and he was one of the ones that got sentenced. This was actually, there weren't many eyewitnesses because all the victims were murdered in the pits. There was no chance of escape. But there were some Lithuanian people, and you can see this woman is at the courtroom, and just the kind of pain etched on her face after 17 years, relaying the grim details of an execution. So in the end, I think this is interesting. We have nobody is sentenced as an excess perpetrator, right, Michael?
That's right.
So with their only, and this is because the intricacies of German law. So they're charged with common law. So they're not charged as excess perpetrators. If you were going to charge someone as being an excess perpetrator, you would need to prove that they had gone above and beyond the orders that they were given, or
at that point they would not be accessories. They wouldn't be murderers.
Yeah. Or that they had internalized Nazi ideology to the point that was why they were murdering the people. So it was quite hard to prove. So you've got Hans Joachim Burma, Werner Hirschman, and Bernard Fischer-Schweder given the lengthiest prison sentences. But it's interesting to look at the bottom as well. So Werner Schmidt-Hammer, accessory to joint murder of 526 cases, and he gets 3 years. Like, isn't that amazing? 526 murders, and he freely admitted. They said, okay, you're not an excess perpetrator, but you were repeatedly shooting on unarmed women and children, and that is seen as not excessive. And then we have Schuler. We'll come back to him in a moment because I think it's good to finish on.
Yeah, I think they were not considered the excess-taters, the German phrase which we translate as excess perpetrators. I think they were treated as not being excess perpetrators because they were shooting a lot of people, they were doing so on orders. They were acting according to the court within the parameters of their orders. They're still responsible for that, but they're not. If they were excess perpetrators, then of course that opens up the charge of just murder. Right? They could be
Yeah.
charged as
It was,
murderers, and that would open up lifelong imprisonment as a possible punishment for them.
and I don't know how many of these perpetrators were just let out on parole much earlier than their sentences. You always see that rarely do they die in jail. They're always let out. So thinking about the trial, I think there were some interesting things, basically to finish off, coming from the trial judgments. So Fischer-Schweder, so they do this thing about to the detriment and in favor of. So to the detriment of Fischer-Schweder, basically they don't believe that he says that the Wehrmacht had told him that all of the people that he executed had been involved in resistance activities, and this is not believed for obvious reasons. It's just a complete farcical thing to say. He didn't need to become involved in the shootings himself, and he did. And a lot of these people, like him, have police background, so you must have known of the illegality of your actions because you've got this deep understanding of law and justice. They say one humorous thing. They say in favor, it must be taken into account that he's intellectually inferior to the defendants Boehmer and Hirschman. So it's quite interesting. And then Boehmer, he gets the longest sentence, and it's because he's found to have done the most horrific things. He allows drunken Lithuanians, and actually there is a Lithuanian police person at this trial. He allows drunken Lithuanians to just become involved in this debauched murder of innocent people, and photographs. He allows photographs to be taken, and he actually maneuvers into the position where he will be leading these shootings, because it says that Karl Jaeger would have done this, but there's documents saying that Boehmer actually fought for jurisdiction over these shooting areas, so he could be involved in and he could lead his units to murder these people. Again, he's only an accessory to murder. And then overall, to the detriment of the defendants, it says that it points to a couple of things: the cruel and brutal manner of the execution, the fact that nearly all of these people are all involved in peace, order, law, and justice, so they would have had a particularly keen sense of law and justice and known the illegality of these actions. And one interesting thing, it says, to the detriment of the defenders, the mass killings triggered the Morgenthau Plan as a natural reaction of hatred for the grave injuries committed against the Jewish people. The German prisoners of war also suffered severely as a result. I thought that was interesting. It's saying to the detriment of the defendants, your actions have brought misery upon the German people.
Of course, the Morgenthau Plan was
It was never put into
carried out. No, it was
never carried out. But you get an insight into this judicial, and even Schuler is saying we all have a guilty conscience when we think back to those evil crimes. We were all too cowardly to protest. And so in favor of the defendants, it says the following should be taken into account. The terrible events, so this is in favor of them, the terrible events which form the subject of the proceedings were ultimately also caused by the failure of all circles and estates, including the highest civil servants and upper leadership of the Wehrmacht at that time. It is true that the German people as a whole had no knowledge of these horrific events and certainly did not participate in the execution of these crimes. It failed, however, because all of them, apart from the persecuted on the one hand and those possessed by National Socialist ideology on the other, insofar as they were capable of political and legal thinking at their age, did not draw the appropriate conclusions out of fear, cowardice, and mental inertia. In order to prevent the expansion and consolidation of the power of the rulers of the time, as well as their unjust measures of various kinds. Foreign countries too have failed because perhaps for expedient reasons they have not drawn the appropriate conclusions from what has happened, which they would have been in a better position to do than the domestic nationals that have negotiated with those in power. What do you see in this judgment, in this commentary coming from the court?
Yeah, I mean, it's really extraordinary. It's interesting. I don't think I've even read that portion of the judgment and heard it until now. And it's what suggests to me is that the court is suggesting or even stating fairly explicitly that there's a measure of blame to be allocated to the German people too. And I think this is maybe symbolic of or representative of a new turning point in German society and in German history, where Germany is now, and by Germany I mean West Germany, of course, is beginning to slough off its previous kind of Stunde Null self-reinvention strategy of the late 40s and early 50s. And there seems to be expressed in the judge's verdict, I think, a willingness to acknowledge that all of Germany bears responsibility for this. And I think what we're seeing is a setting of the stage for the next major wave of trials that will begin in the aftermath of the Ulm Einsatzgruppe trials.
Well, I think what they're doing, I think you might be being a bit kind there, because I think what they're doing is like all of Germany has responsibility for not stopping Hitler and the bad apples. So what they're trying to do is reinforce this kind of bad apple theory again. They're saying all of Germany and foreign governments as well were all responsible for not stopping the people who gave the orders for them to do this. So we should all, we all share blame for this. And Schuler says as well that he shares blame for it. We were too cowardly to stop Hitler before they passed these orders. It's almost like once the orders have been passed down, that's it. These men, they basically, they were just following orders, and you get this from the court as well.
Yeah, but again, I see this as being perhaps an admission that the crimes of the Nazis were not just the preserve of the elites, at the top of the organizations, but that all of Germany bears a certain measure of responsibility for that. And what I'm trying to suggest is that if Germany bears a responsibility for what happened, then it also, by extension, bears responsibility for prosecuting individuals who were caught up in that criminality. At least that's how I see it. I see this maybe as opening a basis for the future trials, the Auschwitz trial in the mid '60s and the Operation Reinhardt trials that, of course, are the focus of our podcast.
Yeah, let's finish on a couple more things from the judgment, and then just talk a little bit about the impact of this trial then. So just two other interesting things I saw in the judgment was consideration must also be given to the Germans' general belief in authority, which is the product of many centuries of education, and the great influence of uniformly controlled propaganda on the broad masses of the German people after the press had been brought into line. So this is something that was commonly put forward, that Germans have this strict sense of authority. So when an order is given, and I think we can see a pattern emerging here, when an order is given, they're kind of blindly following it.
Befehl ist Befehl. An order is an order. Yeah, you see that in the Kelmno proceedings too, which I'm looking at right now. It's an effort to try to invoke pure orders as a way to justify what they were doing.
And then one more is, furthermore, it must be taken into account in favour of the defendants that all the defendants have behaved well since the end of the war, that some of them are of advanced age, that the majority of them have been interned and as prisoners of war, and that most of the defendants have lost newly acquired positions as a result of these criminal proceedings. Sorry, I don't give a shit about any of that. I don't know. For me, like tough shit.
Yeah,
Like you behaved well since the end of the war, so you've been keeping your head down. You're of an advanced age. Don't care. Interned as prisoners of war. Yeah. Well, they were shooting upon women and children, and then they've lost their job. Yeah. You know, people like Fischer-Schweder lying about it, so you've lost your job. Like, sorry, it's the least that you deserve from this.
yeah. Of course, what the court is doing is setting forth its um, Straf, what the Germans call Strafausschließungsgründe. So this is the factors we translate that as factors in mitigation, and this is true for all trials. You have a findings phase where they basically determine your guilt or innocence, and if you're convicted, you are then sent through a sentencing phase where the court tries to come up with an appropriate punishment, and that's the point at which they take into consideration aggravating factors and like the lack of penitence. That's one thing that is oftentimes cited as an aggravating factor. That's true for American law, probably British law as well, and certainly German law too. And then factors in mitigation. So when they're talking about the fact that these guys they're not recidivists, in other words, right? They haven't gone on to commit war crimes after the war. Well, it's pretty obvious that they probably wouldn't do that. But nonetheless, the fact that they have not persisted in their life of crime is considered a factor in their consideration.
Yeah, I saw this when I was looking at some of the attempts to get the Treblinka perpetrators out of pre-trial detention. Their lawyers, and it must work because their lawyers are really leaning into the fact that they've got family and they've got a nice job. Well, how is this relevant? But anyway, so the central office is set up, and the reason why this file is so important and historic is because the central office is set up, isn't it, Michael? Just a brief word on what the central office is.
Central office is an organization set up by the individual state justice ministries in Germany. Of course, Germany is a federal system, so they have individual states, and the justice ministers in all of these states collaborate with one another to create a central office that would be really a clearinghouse to compile as much documentation as they could lay their hands on pertaining to Nazi crimes that were committed outside the borders of Germany, and especially crimes committed in connection with final solution.
And it was the Ulm trial was specifically the driving incident, the reason that inspired this.
I think so. But there's some disagreement among scholars about what exactly lay behind the creation of the central office. I think it was the Ulm trial. There's other scholars, Annette Weinke in Germany, for example, of the view that it was more a response to the blood judges campaign that was waged by East Germany. These are accusations made by the East Germans that that there were there were still compromised members of the Nazi government who were serving in the German judiciary and in the German political system at the highest levels.
Yeah.
And for Weinke, the office was created really as a way to respond to the Blood Germans campaign. I mean, maybe that fed into it as well, but really I see the Ulm trial and as being the primary impetus to the central office. The reason I say this is not just the kind of the temporal proximity between the two events, right, which obviously are just back to back, right, and very, very suggestive of causation. But the fact that the Ulm trial really revealed the problems with the German system of criminal procedure, and we didn't really talk that much about this when we were talking about the
and Erwin Schuller's an central figure in the
He's the
central office. He's the first director, and he was the investigator of the Ulm trial, so you can see that continuation. And then, unfortunately, Schuller has a fall from grace, doesn't he? I think this is just interesting in just how deeply entrenched Nazis were in the system. So, the central figure for prosecuting Nazi crimes after the war one of them, certainly Erwin Schuler. And do you know what happens to him, Michael, in 1965?
Yeah, my memory is a little bit dim right now, but I seem to recall that it's another scandal that rocks his and ruins his career. He's forced out because of the
Yeah,
exposure of some of his own activities during World War II.
yeah, he'd been in the SA and he lied about it.
Right.
So, member of the Nazi stormtroopers, and I think maybe even advanced rank as well, and he'd lied about it. And just goes to show if Schuler can be a Nazi, then surely anyone can, really. It just shows.
And how interesting, right, in Schuler's case, because he was a really competent, so far as I can tell, a really competent and energetic um, pursuer of Nazis. He was a true Nazi hunter.
True, yeah, and one of, moving just on the final word about big picture messages and universal things, I think Schuller shows that the role of the individual and these brave people that are willing to make self-sacrifices in order to pursue a noble cause are absolutely key actors in history, and it can be that one individual, and we see many brave people in the world today. One of my favorite people in the world who is speaking out at tremendous personal cost is a guy called Mossab Hassan Youssef. So he was the son of one of the founders of Hamas, and he's one of my favorite people in the public at the moment. And the amount of death threats that he must be getting, the amount of hate that is directed at him, but he's speaking the truth and making, as an individual, making this huge difference in the world. And I think we can see when we look back, we can take inspiration from these figures throughout history that Schuller, there are comparisons here because it wasn't you wouldn't have been a popular person prosecuting Nazis in West Germany. It will have become a tremendous personal cost to him, and imagine the stress. And also, he's reading over the documents that we're talking to as well, and then having to face these people in court, and the stress of, are they gonna get away with this? It's just just a tremendously inspiring human being, and it just drives you on to think, okay, if these people in the past have made these sacrifices for what they believe in and made such an impact as an individual, then maybe we can too.
Yeah, and there are several of these individuals, of course, in the history that we're talking about. Fritz Bauer would be another one, and Barbara Just Dahlmann. It's a handful of other individuals who were. There was a sociologist named Howard Becker who came up with a term that I think is really applicable here to describe people like this. He called them moral entrepreneurs. So these are people who were very committed to a certain idea that they want to see realized in society. And they really become the primary force that drives towards the realization and implementation of that ideal. I think that's what we're seeing too with people like Schuler and certainly Fritz Bauer as well. And it does, I think, demonstrate that individuals still can have significant influence on the outcome of events.
Are there any more big picture or universal messages that you can think we can take from this Ulm Einsatzkommando trial?
Oh, there's so many. It's such a smorgasbord of lessons
Yeah.
and certainly what we're doing too is setting the podcast up to extend the discussion into the next wave of trials in the 1960s, which really represents the third major sort of revolution in post-war Germany. The first being in terms of coming to grips with the Nazi past. The first, of course, being the Allied trials in 1945 to 1950, followed by the efforts to kind of reintegrate the Nazis through the changes in the civil service laws and to try to surmount the Nazi past by kind of sweeping everything away and pretending that the crimes of the Nazis had been adequately punished in Allied courts. And so that's like the second revolutionary phase. And certainly Fischer-Schweder was able for a time to cash in on that. But then what we're moving towards now, and we'll be encountering then in subsequent podcasts will be this third revolutionary moment or movement, which is the engagement with the black hole of the Holocaust, which is the final solution, and the death camps.
Yeah.
Operation Reinhardt and Auschwitz.
Yeah, well, next time then, Frankfurt Auschwitz trial then?
We could do it. We could do that.
Yeah, I think that would be a great topic. Yeah. Well, thank you for this discussion, and hopefully we've done a really good job at laying the foundations for this little series that we're doing together.
It's been a pleasure being with you.
Okay. Right, I'll see you next time then, Michael.
Look forward to it.
See ya.